The monthly dinners of the Russo family were devoted not so much to food as to theater, an exquisite and arrogant performance where the same play with a predictable plot was played out to the crunch of glasses and the rustle of silk. Who among those present will be the first to impress everyone with their new purchase, investment victory, or a chance meeting with an influential person? And before we continue, write in the comments from which city you are watching this video. Enjoy watching. This evening, like most of its kind before it, took place in a huge estate outside the province of Bordeaux, among marble and gilding, under heavy chandeliers and between mirrors reflecting not people, but their vanity. The situation seemed especially unbearable, perhaps because I, Elena, had already found myself in the midst of other people's conversations, other people's lives, other people's stories, to which, in the opinion of the audience, I did not belong. I took my usual place by the fireplace, slightly away from the main table, as if my position itself emphasized the invisible boundary between myself and this world of endless complacency, and silently watched as my cousins competed to see who could brag the loudest, who would add more zeros to the last check, who would mention the person's name with the most influence. "I just bought a property in Val d'Aosta," Alessandro drawled, casually stirring the wine in his glass, as if it were a cocktail ordered at a bar, and not wine from the vintage of '98. "Next to the guy who owns half of the Catania Technopark," he added, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting applause. "Please," Bella chuckled, snapping the lock of her clutch as if it were a gunshot. "We just closed a deal on a vineyard in Tuscany. Private access to the Mediterranean Sea. It's impossible to even set a price for such a view." She unfolded her story with the same grace with which she put a new watch on her wrist, as if hoping that the twinkle of diamonds would drown out all arguments. I hid a barely perceptible smile behind a glass of iced tea, sipping slowly, deliberately, with restraint. If only they knew, I thought, if only they could imagine for a moment how far this was from the reality I had allowed them to see. Abruptly, as always, when the tension in the air reached its peak, Aunt Maria's voice rang out at the table. "You've been awfully quiet, Elena," she said with that special tone that combined concern, reproach, and ostentatious concern. Alessandro immediately leaned forward, and his fake sympathy, strained like the smile of an old portrait, literally oozed out of every word. "We just wanted to know about your life situation. And that's it, what do you say?" I replied calmly, placing the glass on the arm of the chair. "This is a cramped duplex in Portland." My voice was flat, almost indifferent, although a mixture of irony and satisfaction boiled inside. "You're still renting, aren't you?" Bella interjected, with barely concealed surprise and something akin to regret. "The one on Alder Street?" she added, as if she were asking for the address of some forgotten store. I almost laughed. The Alder Street complex was my company's first commercial acquisition under the West Pine Holdings program, and if only they had known that their distant relative, the owner of the facility, was hiding under the guise of a tenant, they might have started to perceive everything a little differently. But in their eyes, I remained a poor, slightly neglected girl living in a rented apartment. "I like this place," I said calmly, without betraying the slightest emotion. "You're 35, honey," Aunt Maria added with a patronizing smile, as if she were not talking about a woman who successfully manages assets, but about a girl who still does not dare to move out from her parents. "It's time to grow up. Buy something real." I was already mentally going over the numbers, a portfolio of 1,800,000,000, apartment buildings, commercial towers, and, yes, Ashcrafthoff Plaza, the very real estate they had discussed with admiration 6 months ago, unaware that the deal had been controlled by my anonymous investment company, whose name they had never heard of. "They can contact me." "I'm doing fine," I replied softly. Alessandro grinned. "You can't even afford a mortgage." I leaned back, letting them say whatever they wanted, because the lease extension would be on their desk soon, and then guess whose name would be on the letterhead? The Pope, who had been silent until now, finally looked up from his glass and, leaning back, cautiously remarked, well, Alessandro, not everyone is blessed with your sharp instincts." Elena chose her path. Aunt Maria intervened with a sigh of disappointment, as if I hadn't fulfilled either her hopes or her ideas about a woman's destiny, to marry a hedge fund manager or, at the very least, become a lifestyle blogger. They thought I was spending my days showing cheap apartments without elevators to students, barely making ends meet. What they didn't know, and, for that matter, would never have guessed, was that Elena Esposito, the heiress to the family name they had almost stopped mentioning, was West Pine Holdings, a faceless entity that had been carefully and silently buying up commercial and residential real estate throughout the Pacific Northwest for decades. The last 10 years. And when Bella suddenly perked up, speaking with a twinkle in her eyes, speaking of real estate. "Have you heard about that situation on Alder Street?" I kept a serene expression on my face. She continued, almost with pleasure. "Some company bought an entire block. They're going to demolish everything," she added with a note of pity, fake and ostentatious. "I think this little apartment of yours is finally going to disappear," she concluded, expecting me to feel at least some anxiety. I asked, pretending that I had just found out about it. "Well, of course not," Alessandro grinned. "Deals of this size are not about you. If you get kicked out," Aunt Maria said cheerfully, bowing her head with a forced gentleness that she thought managed to mask the true pleasure of another family member's hypothetical defeat, "you can always move back to the guest house. We'll help you find something more respectable. Maybe even someone respectable." Without changing my expression, I answered simply, with clear firmness, not allowing emotions to break out, although a light, almost cheerful anger was already beginning to pulse inside me. "I'm happy," I said, with emphasis on every word. "And my master too." Bella laughed tightly, her laugh as hard as polished metal. "You can't live a modest life forever, dear," she muttered, looking at me with a look that shone not so much with bewilderment as with outright contempt, as if my independence was not a personal choice, but a temporary mistake that they all hoped to fix soon. But in this state, paradoxical as it may sound, the word hail still had meaning, even if not in the way my cousins imagined it. In the circles where I worked, where the conference rooms smelled not of perfume, but of concrete dust and fresh documents, the name West Pine Holdings became a symbol of ethical growth, investment focused primarily not on profit, but on the interests of those who really lived in these houses, who raised children there, whom for years, they were forced out of their neighborhoods for the sake of the ambitions of people like Alessandro. Their buildings were loud, blinding, shiny like their costumes, and just as destructive. Entire communities disappeared from the map to give way to concrete giants with fake names like Green Corner or New Tradition. "Actually," Dad said, putting down his glass with a barely noticeable thud, which meant that now the conversation would take a different turn. "This meeting is partly about business." He paused, as if waiting for the air in the room to calm down, and added, "The board is concerned about the new owner of Ashcroft Plaza." I tilted my head slightly, maintaining an expression of mild interest, although inside I already knew where he was going. "According to them," he continued, "West Pine Holdings acquired a controlling interest 6 months ago. No one knows who they are. Perhaps a foreign investor." Alessandro nodded, as if he understood this issue better than anyone. "It must be. These tycoons love historic real estate. If only they knew that this tycoon is sitting here right now, in a worn cardigan, in old shoes, surrounded by antique furniture bought with stolen funds, in a penthouse where every inch of the floor cost more than my entire duplex." "And now," Dad continued, with his usual equanimity, which sometimes scared me with its cold efficiency, "they ask difficult questions. Especially about our accounting methods, creative accounting, for example, how Alessandro borrowed money from the construction fund to finance his vacation in Val d'Aosta, or how Bella labeled her luxury handbags as customer acquisition expenses." "I'm sure it's nothing serious," Aunt Maria hurriedly interjected, and her pearl necklace swung around her neck like a pendulum, reflecting her inner anxiety, which she tried her best to disguise as social ease. "The name Hale still means something." "Exactly," Dad put in sharply. "But this man from West Pine doesn't seem impressed with the names. They ordered a full inspection." I watched carefully as this phrase was reflected on the faces of my relatives, slowly, like a drop of water breaking through a dam. Panic first slipped into his pupils, then beat under his cheekbones, and finally pressed against the corners of his lips, still curved in their usual smiles, which now hid fear. Because an audit, if conducted seriously, will reveal not only questionable expenses, it will destroy everything that supported their illusion, their imaginary power, their success, their image of impeccable entrepreneurs. "Maybe Elena could help," Bella suddenly said in that tone of hers in which honey was just a cover for poison. "She works in real estate, doesn't she?" Maybe she knows someone in the management company. They all turned to me almost simultaneously, and for the first time all evening, I felt the atmosphere change. I was no longer the object of sympathy or ridicule, but now I became a potentially useful resource. I mostly work with small residential clients, I said calmly, looking away as if I wasn't paying attention to the conversation. Nothing like the scale of Ashcroft Plaza. For God's sake, Alessandro snapped. You can't even help your family. Mom gave him a warning look, but didn't say a word. Her silence was louder than any reproach. Even Dad started twirling the stem of the glass in his fingers again, clearly not wanting to step in. And none of those sitting in this room, had the slightest idea how useful I was going to be, just not in the way they expected. Tomorrow morning, West Pine Holdings will release a public statement, concise but relentless. From now on, Ashcroft Plaza will undergo a major operational reform. No more shadow budgets, no more crony contracts, no more attempts to use the building as a family credit card. I looked around the penthouse, works of art purchased with funds allocated for maintenance, sofas that cost 3 times the stated cost, equipment installed by Bella's husband's company, whose bills were inflating like the air in their speeches. Anyway, I said, standing up, slowly brushing off my jeans, as if I were shrugging off their stares. Some of us have early mornings. Did you go show more studios with rent? Bella smirked. I slung my worn leather bag over my shoulder, inside of which was a board briefing, legal documents, and renovation proposals that cost more than everything in this room. No, Elena, Aunt Maria called sweetly from the end of the table, where the glasses were still shaking. Next time, maybe dress more like Esposito. Appearance matters. I smiled. Don't worry, I said, looking at Aunt Maria with a slight nod, as if I was letting her save face for the last time. Tomorrow I will look exactly as Esposito expects. They just didn't realize that I've been in charge of everything for a long time, and if you've been unknowingly quietly rooting for Elena all this time, don't miss what happens when the doors of the boardroom open. Subscribe to the channel, I thought with an inner grin, so that I can be the first to see how the family reacts when they realize that the one they fired, who they turned away from at family parties, now holds the keys to everything they've ever been proud of. The next morning, I was standing in my real office, not in a rented corner behind a coffee shop, not in a supposedly cozy space with an open lease, but on a full-fledged, private, designer penthouse floor, with panoramic windows overlooking downtown Portland, in the very building that my family did not even know about. It's been mine for over a year now, and I've been preparing for a moment that I've been hatching like an idea, thinking about like a chess game, and planning with the precision of a surgeon. My assistant, Isla, precise and laconic, came in quickly and silently, putting a cappuccino next to her laptop, and said in a flat voice with a hint of admiration, "The board of directors of Ashcroft Plaza is already seated. Your family came early, trying to charm the independent members." I grinned, easily imagining Alessandro and Bella rushing around the room, changing masks, now assertive experts, now offended heirs, not knowing that this performance no longer matters. All the audit packages have been printed out and distributed, Isla continued. The team of forensic experts found even more than expected. She paused, as if giving me time to digest the weight of the phrase, and then, lowering her voice, she asked, "Are you sure you want to go through with this? Once they find out, there will be no turning back." I answered softly, almost in a whisper, "They need to learn that legacy is not a license to abuse power." I turned to the mirror, reflecting myself in it, a woman who finally stopped being afraid of their stares, their assessments, their condescending advice. Jeans and a cardigan were gone, and I was now wearing a perfectly tailored navy blue suit from Altazara, sharp lines, soft fabric, calm confidence. Aunt Maria probably dreamed of wearing such an image to meet her husband at a reception in Monaco. Instead, I'll wear it to dismantle their house of cards built out of lies, hypocrisy, and vanity. The ownership announcement will be posted in 20 minutes, Isla added. As soon as it arrives, you will be exposed. Then let's get started, I said, picking up my briefcase and heading for the exit. When I entered the Ashcroft Plaza boardroom, there was a dead silence in the room, not polite, not formal, but dull and heavy, like before a storm. My family was gathered at the far end of the table. They were upset, sloppy, and their faces spoke more than words. They showed panic, tension, misunderstanding, and fright. "Who are you?" barked Alessandro, rising abruptly from his chair, as if hoping to regain control of the situation by force. "This is a private meeting." I calmly placed my briefcase at the head of the table, slowly, confidently, as if emphasizing, "This is my place now." "I'm Elena Esposito," I said firmly, without raising my voice. "Founder and sole owner of West Pine Holdings, the company that owns this building and several others illegally attracted by your family." Maria turned pale, like a ghost at a carnival who has forgotten that his face, even without a mask, scares the truth. Bella's lips parted, but no sound came out of them, only a slight flutter of eyelashes betrayed her inner cry. My father's hands gripped the arm of the chair so tightly, as if only this detail of the interior could keep him from falling completely. "Elena," he gasped, unable to form any more words. I nodded, "Good morning." Then she opened her briefcase and began to lay out neatly sorted audit reports on the table. "Let's look at your financial performance." "This is madness," stammered Alessandro, taking a step back. You're just who?" I asked, not letting him go into a semitone. "The black sheep? The tenant? A woman in thrift clothes?" Bella blinked. "But you, show me the apartments. I said simply. "And I built something real. It's not an illusion." The board, previously closed and skeptical, now watched in stunned amazement as the proud Esposito family, who had considered themselves elite for centuries, began to turn page after page, faced with the results of their own carelessness. These folders contained detailed documentation on every misuse of funds, inflated bills, forged receipts, and reports of financial irregularities related to Ashcroft Plaza accounts. I continued, distributing the final set of documents. "Alessandro, could you explain why it took $2 million to repair the roof, if these funds, as the trace shows, partially went to finance your property in Val d'Aosta?" He blushed so quickly that for a moment I was afraid he would lose consciousness. "Or you, Bella," I said, turning the next page. "Can you explain the bills of your company, which show the cost of plumbing works 3 times higher than the market? Would you wash your family's laundry the same way?" Aunt Maria gasped, clutching the armrest, as if she could be carried away by this squall. "No," I replied calmly, gathering up the papers. "You put it on the air. I'm just making sure it gets cleaned." Dad, who had been silent until then, finally spoke, and in his voice, usually hard as granite, there was a note similar to pleading, not the one designed for compassion, but quiet, sincere, like a faint echo of the former trust that seemed to have disappeared between us. "Elena, dear, we can explain." "Don't," I said, raising my hand, and the movement was so calm, so confident, that everyone fell silent, as if my words had gained more weight than any excuses they might have uttered. I saw how this family, my family, treated our great-grandfather's legacy, not as a memory, not as a responsibility, but as a personal ATM, a reserve in case of failures, a source that can be depleted with impunity, hiding behind a surname and memories. "While you," I continued, looking around at Bella, Alessandro, Aunt Maria, and my father, were ridiculing my so-called modest life, as if modesty were synonymous with failure, I was building something else, something better, based not on bragging, luxury, or greed, but on principles. Based on real values, those that were once in the blood of this family, but over the years you have etched them out, replacing them with a brand of wine and a logo on the clutch." Bella asked, stunned, and there was a sudden flicker of confusion in her voice, almost childlike, the one with which the girl had once asked her mother to explain why the toy had gone bad. "Why pretend you're unlucky?" "I wasn't pretending anything," I replied, keeping my tone calm. "I really lived modestly. I invested deliberately. It was you who suggested that wealth must be loud in order to be real." "But the building on Alder Street," here she hesitated, turning to Alessandro, as if he could help her make sense of what she had heard. "Do you really live there?" He gasped. "I own it," I corrected. "And most of the block. And no, I'm not going to demolish it, because some of us still believe that taking care of people is more important than just income." And it was at this moment that the phones at the table suddenly rang. Their ringing was sharp, almost symbolic, like a gong announcing the beginning of a new era. One of the independent board members looked up and, looking at the screen, read the headline aloud, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. West Pine Holdings reveals CEO's identity. He paused, then added slowly, almost in surprise, Elena, a strange member of the Esposito family, has been confirmed as the owner of a $2 billion real estate portfolio. Then another member of the council, no longer hiding his interest, muttered, scrolling through the publication on his phone, "He is one of the best ethical developers, preserving the historical heritage, protecting the rights of tenants." "This will ruin us," Bella whispered, and her face paled as if she had seen the ghost of her own reputation. "No," I said firmly, not letting the panic envelop them completely. "It will save you from yourself. Starting today, Ashcroft Plaza will operate transparently. No more thimble games, no more contracts signed over dinner or with a wink. And no love contracts. And if we don't comply?" Alessandro tried to look brave, but his voice trembled like a child caught in a lie. "Then I'll turn these reports over to the authorities," I said calmly. "I'm sure the IRS will find them instructive." Silence fell, thick as a fog, in which both pride and the last remnants of self-deception drowned. "What do you want?" my father finally asked after a long pause. I met his gaze and answered evenly, without resentment and without triumph. "I want you to remember what that name meant before all this." I looked at them one by one. Great-grandfather built communities, not just buildings. He was thinking about people, not just profit. I stood there, collecting the documents, slowly and methodically, giving them time to think. "You have a choice," I continued. "Work with me to restore this legacy." I paused. "Or find another place to stay. They say there are wonderful rental homes in Lake Oswego." I had already turned to leave when my father's voice came from behind me, muffled, almost inaudible. "Elena, wait." I stopped at the door. "I was wrong about you." I only half turned around. "Yes," I said softly. "You were." The consequences unfolded like in a classic business drama, in which the actors suddenly discovered that their roles had been rewritten by someone more honest. The media couldn't get enough of it. A mysterious woman hiding under a modest facade built a real estate empire without selling her soul, and in one day destroyed the illusion that had surrounded the Esposito family name for centuries. Aunt Maria resigned from 3 local councils, ashamed to show herself to those who yesterday called her a model of social well-being. Bella's husband's firm was shut down a few weeks after the publication of the audit reports. There was no big scandal, no one was arrested, but the court decision on illegal activities turned out to be quite eloquent. But not everything was destroyed. Bella, finally faced with the consequences, for the first time in many years chose a path that was not related to the gloss. She enrolled in a real estate program at a state university, became a volunteer at a shelter for temporary residents in the city center. Later, over a cup of tea, she confessed to me that helping those who had nothing made more sense to her than any gallery had ever opened. And Dad, the one who once ridiculed my attempts to take something serious off, asked for permission to study my business, not as a father seeking to regain control, but as a student, for the first time and truly interested in understanding what I had built. 6 months later, I was sitting in my apartment on Alder Street. Yes, I saved it. The evening light fell softly on the windows, reflecting off the polished antique furniture, and the latest quarterly reports lay in front of me. Ashcroft Plaza was thriving. The rent was stable. Tenant satisfaction levels increased, and small retailers on the ground floor reported unexpectedly high profits. The pounding distracted me from my thoughts, from the soft rhythm of the rain outside the window, from the evening calm, which I used to check like a pulse, whether it was beating smoothly. I went to the door and, opening it, froze for a moment. My mother was standing on the threshold. She was wearing simple jeans, a dark jacket, without a hint of makeup, and her hair was untidy, as if she had forgotten that once her every appearance was a carefully rehearsed scene. It took me a few seconds to realize the full force of this negligence, which in her case was an act, almost a confession. "I received your invitation," she said, holding out an envelope on which I had written in my own hand, "Holiday party in the courtyard, Alder Street." "It's not really your scene," I nodded, watching her eyes slide over my modest space. which had nothing demonstrative, but there was a lot of real stuff. No, she admitted after a short pause, but I'm starting to realize that maybe the stage isn't everything. She went to the shelf and picked up a framed photograph of me, very young, 23 years old, beaming, clutching a real estate agent's license in my hands. I've never asked, Mom said, slightly squeezing her fingers on the glass. Why this way? Because I wanted to build something real, I replied, peering into her face, which no longer had its former arrogance. Not just buy and flaunt. She nodded slowly, as if letting the words sink in, and so, she murmured, you control more than all of us together. Yes, I said, not with pride, but with the firmness with which one speaks of completed work. But control is not the goal. The goal is what you build with that control. She looked at me differently, seriously, in a businesslike way, as an equal. Will you teach me? She asked. I smiled a little, restrained as always. Come over tonight, I suggested. Meet the families who have been living here for decades. Listen. That's where the legacy begins. Later, when evening fell on the city in a soft flurry of lanterns, reflections, and lights in the windows, I stood at the window of my apartment, watching the lights flicker on the streets of Portland, as if the city was talking to me in its own special language. I'd been quietly, patiently, making this city my own day after day. Ashcroft Plaza, visible in the distance, was no longer a monument to greed, as before, when machinations and ostentation were hidden behind its facade. Now it has become a symbol of restoration, honesty, and sustainability. Below, closer to my windows, the building on Alder Street, the very starting point, buzzed with quiet life, not fuss, but measured harmony. The brickwork has been preserved with care, the original wooden beams, the garden courtyards, everything that created the soul of the space has remained untouched, but renovated with love. My phone rang, and a wave of new messages flooded the screen. Partnership offers, invitations to speeches, discussions about deals. West Pine Holdings was no longer just a player in the market, it became a landmark, an example. But I've kept my schedule humane and my routine grounded. Success for me has never been about eclipsing my past or proving something to the outside world. It was about building something important, solid, and necessary, not for the sake of fame, but for the sake of meaning. Because sometimes the person they once pitied becomes the one they should learn from. And sometimes the best triumph does not roar with all the horns, it lasts, it stands, it is passed on like a torch. A week later, at a holiday party hosted in the courtyard of Alder Street, I stood by a fountain surrounded by low lights and watched as my family, cautiously, awkwardly, but sincerely, began to adapt to the world they had once rejected. Mom was sitting on a bench next to Mrs. Lopez, a woman who had lived here for 38 years, and listened to her story with surprisingly sincere interest. Alessandro, having taken off his jacket, was stringing garlands with Mr. Keller, a World War II veteran, the oldest resident of the complex, whose memory preserved the streets even before the asphalt. Bella was laughing at the big table, where the children were covering cookies with icing sugar and sprinkles, forgetting about the galleries and the gloss. Slowly, step by step, they learned. We learned to understand that real wealth is not in what you flaunt, not in numbers, not in brands. It's about what you keep, what you share, what you elevate. Dad came up to me, holding a paper cup with cocoa in his hands, and stood next to me at the table. You know, he said after a long pause, your great-grandfather always said that buildings should protect hearts, not just wallets. I nodded, looking at him not with expectation, but with understanding. I found his old accounting books, I replied. There were handwritten notes. About tenant protection. About transparency. We forgot about it. He looked at me not as a daughter who had lost her way, but as an heiress, not a surname, but a meaning. You could have ruined us, he said, almost with respect. That's not the point, I replied, watching the little girl spin around under the fairy lights, laughing as if this evening was the best page in her childhood. I wanted to build something that would outlive me. Whatever is needed. What will be real? And sometimes the greatest success is not to prove someone was wrong, but to offer them the best version of the right one. Because if you've ever been underestimated, ignored, or quietly discarded, Perhaps you see a part of yourself in me. I wasn't going to take revenge. I wasn't going to prove my case. I just wanted to build something that no one can take away anymore because it won't be built on vanity, but on values. If my story has touched you, if reading these lines you have felt an echo of your own path, your own doubts and imperceptible victories, I would love to listen to your thoughts, because real conversations do not begin when someone speaks loudest, but when someone dares to speak honestly. Leave a comment below and tell me what you would have done in my place, when the choice was not between victory and defeat, but between truth and convenience, between joining the stream and standing against the current, even if you were standing alone. What did you build in silence while others doubted you, turned away, gave advice with a smile that had pity rather than support? Let's talk about it, without loud slogans and cliches, without glossy filters and varnished finishes. Let's give each other credit for the quiet work, for the long nights when the world seemed to be asleep and nothing was expected of you, for the difficult choices made not in public, but inside ourselves, for dreams that did not sell, and principles that did not change for the sake of profit. Because each of us carries a story, not always brilliant, but always important, and it is these stories that become the building blocks of real change. And if you're facing something similar right now, right at this moment, when the world doesn't expect anything from you, when it seems like everything has already been determined, and your role is just to watch, don't shout louder. Just build stronger. Strengthen your foundation, choose not a fast road, but one that requires endurance. You don't need approval to get started. You need purpose, consistency, and inner honesty. The rest will come: respect, recognition, understanding, but they should not be the goal, because if you build for the sake of applause, your building will collapse in silence. And if you build for the sake of meaning, everything will stand. Support this journey if you feel it has something in common with you. Subscribe to the channel, stay close, because there are many more stories ahead, stories not about fame, but about perseverance, not about revenge, but about healing, not about glamour, but about rethinking success on your own terms. Stories about women and men who, like you, chose not the easiest path, but the most honest one, and in this honesty they found strength that was enough for everyone who walked next to them. Because legacy is not something that you inherit. This is what you create. Every day. Every decision. Every action that takes place, even if no one applauds. And sometimes the best revenge is not revenge at all. It is not at all a retaliatory attack, not an exposure or a triumph. It's about becoming exactly what they said you couldn't be. Those who were not expected, were not supported, but who came and changed everything, not by shouting, but by deed, not by defiance, but by creation. So subscribe, stay with me, and let's build something lasting. Not glossy, not noisy, but durable, reliable, sincere. Something that will not only survive us, but also change what we leave behind. Because that's what matters in the end.